Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Have you ever really wondered exactly how those businessmen right around the turn of the 20th century got so filthy stinking rich? Well, stick around and that's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey guys, welcome back to Mr. E's classroom. Today we're going to look at the tactics of big business. The question we're going to try to answer is, what new tactics did big businessmen use to gain power and wealth right around the turn of the 20th century? When we talk about big businessmen right around the turn of the 20th century, probably the most successful of all time is going to be this guy right here. His name is Andrew Carnegie. He's considered one of the most successful businessmen probably of all time. He made his fortune in the new steel business. Remember that steel is kind of this wonder product that shows up right around the end of the 1800s. And when I say it made him a fortune, it made him tons of cash. He's estimated to have been worth right around about 310 billion, yes, billion with a B, $310 billion. That's in today's money. That's just an enormous sum of money to have. How exactly did he make that much money? Really, it all boiled down to some new management techniques that he kind of pioneered. When we think about these management techniques, though, they're kind of commonplace today, but right around the turn of the 20th century, nobody had thought about using them. So what am I talking about here? The techniques that he pioneered were called vertical integration and horizontal integration. To help us understand these concepts, I want to show you this chart right here. So take a look at it while we try to explain what each one is. When you're making a product, there are basically three levels of production. You have resources, manufacturing, and distribution. When you own each level of production, all the way from the resources down to distribution, that's called vertical integration. The key thing about vertical integration is you don't have to pay anybody else to do any of those processes for one of your products to go from beginning all the way to the end in a consumer's hands. This makes a lot of money for your pockets. The other concept is called horizontal integration. Once you've basically set yourself up and you can deal with your competitors, you start to gobble them up. You start to buy out everybody in a given segment. You may own all the resources, or all the manufacturing, or all the distribution. This, in today's terms, is called creating a monopoly. It's a little bit frowned upon because it really does cut down on competition. Another huge name of the time that you need to know about is this guy right here. His name was John D Rockefeller. He was also somebody that had just an enormous fortune. His estimated net worth in today's money was right around $410 billion. Again, that's billion with a B. $410 billion. Could you imagine having that much money? What would you spend it on? He got his money by establishing a company called the Standard Oil Company. It basically became what was the biggest and the baddest business trust of all time. That's how Rockefeller made his money, is through using a tactic called business trusts. So what exactly is a business trust? The best way I can describe a business trust is you have to think about three companies. You have Company A and Company B. They're relatively small companies. Then you have Company C. Company C by itself is bigger than both Company A and Company B. Well, if Company A and Company B want to be able to compete against Company C, they're going to have to grow. They could form a business trust. Basically, that's just a business arrangement where two companies combine what they have. They go in and they get an outside person called a trustee to basically run the two companies as one single corporation. That way, A and B combined are bigger than C. And it's easy for them to compete that way. If everything's done correctly, all the profits get divided between Company A and Company B, and everybody's happy. Rockefeller wasn't the only person using this business trust technique. What started happening right around the turn of the 20th century, right at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, is these smaller companies started to realize there's no way they could compete with these big, huge corporations that were being created, like Standard Oil Company. So what they would do is they'd kind of take this, if you can't beat them, join them approach to business. Instead of being just totally stamped out and basically being left with nothing, these smaller businesses would join a larger business or a larger corporation as a way of survival. They figured, hey, I'll get what I can when I can, so at least I have something. And as this technique starts to be used, as these smaller companies join these bigger companies and people like Rockefeller build these massive, massive corporations, what winds up happening is fewer and fewer people start getting more and more and more control over business. And before it's over with, a very few select group of people are left basically running all the business in the country. People like Rockefeller and to some extent Carnegie, they start to get a really bad rap. They get a nickname. The nickname is the robber barons. These guys that kind of start to slowly gobble up entire industries. They basically have a four-step tactic they use. Number one was they try to set themselves up as the go-to company by intentionally undercutting their competition. They would sell things a lot cheaper than they necessarily needed to. As they started to gain control of the market, their competition would start to come to them and say, hey, let us be a part of you so we're left with something. Remember that whole survival thing. Step three was once you had the market kind of cornered, once you had solidified yourself as the player in that particular market or industry, well, you basically jacked your prices back up to make more money. Who's going to compete with you? You're the only game in town. And then you basically expand into another market and do the exact same thing. These tactics these robber barons used really gave them a pretty bad rap that people in the country just really weren't happy with. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot they could do about it because the robber barons basically controlled industry. So what exactly do you do to change that reputation? A lot of these robber barons basically started to give their money away. There's a term called philanthropy. Basically, that just means that you use the money you have for the betterment of humanity. Here are a couple of good examples of philanthropy. Since we've been talking about Rockefeller and Carnegie, I'll give you some examples of what they did with their money to basically buy themselves back into good graces with the American people. Rockefeller gave away about $500 million to help people out. He did things like set up schools and universities. He helped fund a medical campaign to basically get rid of some diseases like yellow fever. And he really helped the University of Chicago grow. Carnegie gave away about 90% of his fortune before he died. He set up things like the Carnegie Corporation for Education, which essentially gave out money to schools all over the country. In fact, it's still around today because of the money he used to help set that corporation up. He also funded all sorts of big arts projects. There's a place in New York City called the Carnegie Hall. It's a huge music hall that you could go listen to music. He also was really big with libraries. He gave tons of money to set up libraries. Carnegie was a huge reader. Eventually, these robber barons, they got so big and so powerful, the government said we have to do something to try to help contain them. In 1890, the government passes a law called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Basically, the Sherman Antitrust Act was designed to prevent business trusts from turning into monopolies. One tiny problem, though. In the Sherman Antitrust Act, they forgot to outline or they forgot to define exactly what a business trust was. When they tried to use this law against people like Rockefeller, they would just come back and say, hey, I don't have a business trust here. This is just a business partnership. And it really basically made the Sherman Antitrust Act kind of unenforceable, which, to be honest, for most of the government was okay, because remember, during this time, the government is mostly Republican run, and those Republicans are mostly business-friendly people, because that's how they made their money too. Alright, before we end this video, a couple things we need to take away from this. First of all, when we look at tactics of the big business right around the turn of the century, remember that it's things like vertical and horizontal integration and using business trusts that really helped create monopolies. The second big thing to take away is remember that a lot of people just turn to the if you can't beat them, join them approach to the business trust. It was better to survive than be totally stamped out and left with nothing. The other big takeaway is that remember that even though you get a bad rap for being a robber baron, you could easily turn that around by using your money for the betterment of mankind and just become a philanthropist. Alright, there you go, guys. Tactics of big business. Hopefully you got good notes. Be ready, there's probably going to be a quiz next time we're in class. Guys, as always, remember, don't ever stop learning.